An argument between global leaders and allies in the public eye like we've never seen before. Australia's leaders still working out how to react while delicate trade negotiations continue. I'm Olivia Caisley, live from the lands of the Ngunnawal people. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. The UK and France will work on a peace plan with Ukraine to present to the United States as European leaders commit to maintaining support for the country for the rest of the war. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and a number of European countries have indicated they plan to be part of the continent's coalition of the willing to help Kyiv after the war. So should Australia contribute? We ask former Ambassador to the United States, Arthur Sinodinos. The Coalition have accused the government of pork barrelling over the locations of 50 proposed urgent care clinics. Labor's rejected those suggestions, but the opposition says the government still has questions to answer. Independent MP Monique Ryan has called on the government to release modelling over the cost effectiveness of the clinics. And China's ambassador to Australia says the government has stretched the definition of a national security risk with a ban on artificial intelligence app DeepSeek. The diplomat says Australia has politicised trade and undermined technological progress. So, has Australia been overcautious? We're joined by artificial intelligence professor Tim Miller to help us unpack this. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese addressed the media before a cabinet meeting this morning and reaffirmed Australia's support for Ukraine following the extraordinary exchange between US President Donald Trump and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office over the weekend.
We regard this as an issue of doing what's right, but also what is in Australia's national interest. The brave people of Ukraine, led so extraordinarily by President Zelensky, are fighting not just for their national sovereignty and for their democracy, they are fighting for the international rule of law. And it is an easy choice that Australia has made. It's a bipartisan position that Australia has had. We've contributed $1.5 billion of support, $1.3 billion of which is military support.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton stood up in his electorate of Dickson today and went a step further than the Prime Minister. He says he was disappointed in the scenes in the White House and underlined that the Coalition's views did differ to the United States.
I was disappointed by the scenes out of the White House, and I believe that President Zelensky requires the support of European countries, of the United States and countries like Australia as well. In relation to Ukraine, the Australian view at the moment is different to the United States, and my job as Prime Minister will be to lobby the President of the United States to reconsider his position in relation to Ukraine, because I think it's in all of our collective best interests if we're able to provide support to Ukraine, and that's something I'm dedicated to.
The government, meanwhile, has wanted to keep its focus on cost of living and health, what it thinks is its strong suit, announcing 50 new urgent care clinics in a second term at a cost of $650 million. Finance Minister Katy Gallagher was here in the studio earlier today. Katy Gallagher, welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Thanks for being here today. I wanted to start on the government's announcements regarding urgent care clinics. So you've pledged to open 50 new urgent care clinics if re-elected. We've heard from Independent MP Monique Ryan, she's also a doctor, accusing your side of politics of pork barrelling with health regarding this. Ultimately, Peter Dutton again has made the same call. Why is this not a case of pork barrelling?
Well, these extra urgent care clinics have been based on advice around hospital presentations and through obviously the work of the Department of Health and Aged Care. We have 87 now operational around the country, and these 50 additional, which goes to the sort of the next level of locations of having those urgent care clinics. So this is based on data and information to the government, and I think many of them, well, I don't understand the claims of pork barrelling because I think they're spread across the country and across electorates with various representatives in them. It's really about where there's gaps, where there's high presentations to emergency departments and where this model could work. But the commissioning of those extra 50 will be done exactly the same way as the last 87, and you work with primary healthcare networks to deliver that.
Okay, well, on that point, though, Dr. Ryan says that it could be useful to get some independent modelling to show the effectiveness of the current urgent care clinics in place. To allay any concerns around pork barrelling, do you think that the government should follow through and release that modelling prior to the election?
Well, there's an independent evaluation underway of the urgent care clinics. That was a decision we took when they got up and running. And so that's based on a whole range of information that will come through. Some of the data I've seen coming through shows quite significant reductions in hospital presentations for less urgent categories.
Yeah.
And so that is really pleasing. We know they're being utilised, about 1.2 million visits. So on the anecdotal feedback we've seen, they're certainly successful, but yes, they will be independently verified.
Yes, but that won't come through until after an election. So do you think that that could be brought forward just to allay those concerns?
Look, I don't think it can be, because it's based on a whole range of data sets, plus many of them have only been operating for a few months. Like, I think probably the longest one's been operating for about 2 years, maybe a year and a half. And so it's collecting data over that time. But these are, I think the Medicare urgent care clinics are highly supported by local communities, but the data which underpins where they go really is fed about a whole range of different inputs from the health system.
Okay, the Albanese government has delivered back-to-back surpluses, but when we look ahead, we are looking at years of deficits. Over the weekend, you've unveiled a policy that will cost the budget $95 million and only save beer drinkers, I believe it's less than 1 cent a pint. How is that fiscally responsible?
Well, you're right in the sense that we've delivered 2 surpluses, but we've also done a lot of the work. We've got about a $200 billion nominal turnaround improvement in the budget since we came to office. That's been because we've returned revenue upgrades to the budget, we've found savings, and importantly, we've put some reform work underway, so aged care and NDIS, for example, which is going to benefit the budget over the medium term. And we've made those decisions because we're wanting to provide as much cost of living support as we can to households. This is an issue that's been raised with us repeatedly by industry. And I think, from our point of view, we've tried to find cost of living for households, a whole range of areas, energy bill rebates, Medicare investments. But this one supports the hospitality industry, and we know reports that they've been doing it tough. We think this is a reasonable and modest investment into supporting the hospitality industry.
I can understand that it's a tricky challenge, obviously, divvying up, what sectors or industries get money, but there'd be a lot of community groups out there who'd love to see $95 million. What do you say to those that are disappointed, who would like funding but don't have it?
Yeah, there's no shortage of calls on the budget, that's for sure. There's a lot more ideas and good ideas than you can fund, and our job is to really work through all of that and find the right balance. Obviously, we're looking at ways to support business, including small business across the economy, but we've also invested heavily in community organisations over the term of government to make sure we are funding them in a proper way, and they've certainly benefited from billions of extra dollars going in. And that's part of why we've been trying to get the budget in better shape so we can make those priority investments. But you're right, there's always more to be done, and there's always more calls than we can support on the budget.
So on that beer excise specifically, would you say that that was a fiscally responsible decision?
Well, we're funding it through the budget, and our budget strategy has been about making sure we can find room for particular investments, find savings, reprioritise, and make sure we can meet all the pressures. And part of our focus has been on cost of living and helping businesses and households with some of the pressure they've been seeing.
Okay, on a different topic, Peter Dutton today says that he was disappointed with the scenes we saw out of the White House's Oval Office over the weekend between US President Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. Are you comfortable with the way that Donald Trump spoke to and treated the Ukrainian president?
Well, I'm not sure there's much use in me commenting on President Trump and his behaviour. People can see the vision and make their own decision about that. We have been absolutely clear that our support is for Ukraine and against the illegal invasion of their country, and we are standing strong with Ukraine and with President Zelensky, throughout, as we have for the last couple of years, and we will continue to do so. We have very strong support for him, the decisions he's taken and the defence of his country.
I understand how difficult it is, to stand up for Australian values, but also keep an ally such as the United States on side. Do you think you could be more full-throated, though, in your support of Ukraine, given, Donald Trump's treatment of Volodymyr Zelensky?
Well, I think we have been clear in our support for Ukraine. It's unequivocal. It's there. It has been. We are the biggest non-NATO donator to Ukraine to help them, particularly with the Bushmasters program. People can make their own decisions about Donald Trump and the way he conducted that meeting, but our commitment and support for President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine remains strong.
And the coalition today has also indicated that a coalition government wouldn't send or doesn't believe that peacekeeping troops should be sent to Ukraine. What's the Albanese government's position?
Well, we'll continue to work with, like-minded countries on support for Ukraine. As I understand it, there's been no request for personnel on the ground, and none is being considered.
In the background of all of this, we do have pending US sanctions on steel and aluminium. Your colleague, the Treasurer Jim Chalmers, went to Washington last week for a variety of reasons, but in part to sort of plead our case on this. Where do you think we are at in those negotiations? Are you confident that Australia will be able to secure a carve-out in these areas?
Well, we're strongly arguing for that, and again, from the Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, the Foreign Minister and the Treasurer have been engaging actively with their counterparts in the US to explain, Australia's position and standing up for our national interests, the fact that we have a trade surplus with the United States, where they're an important ally of ours and of us of them, and so we think there's good arguments for them to consider, and we'll continue to do that.
Those tariffs, though, they're due to come into play, and I believe it's in 9 days now. Where do you think the US will go when it comes to Australia?
Well, I'm not going to speculate, because at the moment we are engaging actively with arguing for our national interest, which is for an exemption from those tariffs. The relationship is very strong. We've had good, solid engagement, and you will continue to argue for an exemption from any tariffs that the US are considering.
When it comes to the budget, it's due on March 25. Do you think Australians can expect that budget on that date, or do you think we'll head to the polls before then?
Well, obviously it's the PM's call when we head to the polls, but Jim and I, the Treasurer and I and our colleagues have done a lot of work over the summer. There's months of work that goes into a budget. It's scheduled for the 25th of March, and certainly all those decisions have been locked down.
Well, do you think an economic budget update would suffice?
Well, we're planning for a budget on the 25th of March. That's the decisions that was taken last year. We've scheduled it. As to when the PM might call an election, that's entirely a matter for him. The Treasurer and I do our jobs, which is to make sure we've got the books in order, and all of those decisions have been taken.
Given the febrile geopolitical environment on the world stage, national security is sort of feeding into the upcoming election in ways that I don't think could have been predicted maybe even 6 months ago. When it comes to defence, will an Albanese government, when it comes to looking at that budget, invest more in defence? Do you think that we should follow Europe in increasing GDP spending, or on defence, I should say?
Well, we've increased defence spending every budget that we've had. It's got a significant increase, over, I think, $50 billion that we've allocated to the budget. So part of the reason to get the budget in better shape was to allow for these investments as well. So we will see defence spending as a share of GDP continue to rise. We inherited a defence budget in a bit of a mess. Richard Marles has done a lot of work to clean that up, and we've made additional investments on that. National security is the number one responsibility of any government, and we take it very seriously, and that's why we've found room in the budget for all that extra funding.
I understand that the percentage on defence spending as a percentage of GDP has increased, but we have seen Emmanuel Macron, for example, this morning saying that Europe should lift it to 3 to 3.5%. That follows the US last week and Donald Trump suggesting that Europe should lift it to 5%. What figure are you aiming for?
Well, I mean, we take advice from the Defence ADF and from national security agencies about what investment is required to keep Australians safe and to keep Australia safe, and we've acted on all of that advice. So, you know, as that continues, we make decisions based on them, but I can absolutely categorically guarantee that defence spending has increased and will continue to increase over the medium term.
So to be clear, we will see additional funding in defence in the upcoming budget?
We have put in extra money into the budget for defence, and that grows year on year, so you will see that.
Katie Gallagher, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
To unpack all of that, Chief Digital Political Correspondent Jacob Grieber joins me now. What did you make there of the Finance Minister's defence against these accusations of pork barrelling? As just to remind viewers, this is in relation to this fresh election promise that a re-elected Labor government would basically open 50 new urgent care clinics.
So, Liv, that's on top of the roughly 50, I think, that they've rolled out since they came to power 3 years ago. They're all over the country. There was a report that it was in Labor seats or seats that Labor was targeting from the Greens or the Coalition. The government is pushing back on that notion. You saw that in your interview. They're saying they're actually spread out quite evenly across the country. There are more Labor seats, so there will be numerically more likely to be in a Labor seat, they're saying. And then there are special cases, such as in the Northern Territory, where there's a greater need. Happens to be Labor territory as well. This side of the election. We'll see what happens afterwards. I think it's also a sign that these are quite effective clinics. People like using them. And I think the coalition's chipping away at the sense that, you know, maybe there's something untoward here. Looks like a pretty standard pre-election kind of hit on what is, I suspect, quite a popular Labor policy.
Do you then think it was interesting that the coalition didn't move to follow or match that funding on urgent care clinics?
They've held back on it. I think they've said yes to a lot of funding, so maybe there's a bit of reticence creeping in to immediately saying yes to everything. We've certainly seen it on the bulk billing issue the weekend before last, where they came up with an extra $9 billion within a few hours of Labor.
We did see extraordinary scenes in the Oval Office at the White House over the weekend. Both sides of politics, both the Coalition and Labor, have backed in Ukraine. But do you think there's a bit of a gap here emerging between the opposition leaders' remarks and Anthony Albanese's when it comes to language, when it comes to the actions of the United States?
I think there's a reluctance still on both sides to criticise Trump directly. They're talking about standing with Ukraine. They're talking about standing against Russia as an aggressor. That language seems pretty consistent across the board. But both sides are sort of going, I guess, around the garden path, the round way, to really be quite... They're actually being quite critical of the White House, but not doing it head to head, as it were. They're talking about Australia's support, the money that's gone in. Peter Dutton has said no to additional troops. I think you heard in your interview there with Katie Gallagher, there's been no such request. She didn't seem to rule it out. I don't think that's suggesting maybe that that's on the table either from the government's point of view. So just the tiniest little difference there between those two positions. But clearly, a lot of unease about that scene that we saw over the weekend, a lot of concern about the Trump administration moving seemingly very much towards the Putin worldview.
Peter Dutton did make the point, though, that if he's elected Prime Minister, that he would actively lobby Donald Trump over the issue of Ukraine. Does that set up a potential wedge, do you think, for Anthony Albanese?
I think so, and I think Peter Dutton senses that the community feels that the Prime Minister's sometimes been quite slow on these geopolitical developments. He's tended to sort of give you muddled talking points. We saw it initially on the flotilla of Chinese vessels in the Tasman. It took a while for the government to harden up its language. Peter Dutton sort of trying to demonstrate that he'd put it to Trump. Now, he didn't say he'd shirt front him. That's a famous other comment from a previous leader, but he's making the argument that he would have a more forceful conversation. And I think you can only voters will answer that question in their minds as to who they think will push the line more forcefully. And I think also people are wondering which of these leaders is worrying about this issue enough so that I don't have to and I can get on with my life, paying mortgages and getting kids to school, that type of thing. So yeah, I think what's fascinating about this whole scene is we've got geopolitical issues spilling into our domestic sphere.
Jacob, thanks so much for your time and your thoughts on what feels like a bit of a tipping point on the world stage.
Cheers.
Health Minister Mark Butler stood up today to hose down allegations of pork barrelling over Labor's pledge to open 50 new urgent care clinics in a second term. He says the decision reflected the geographical spread of need across the country.
Well, I think it's a beat up. If you look at the 50 seats I announced yesterday, about half of them are in Labor-held seats and half of them are in non-Labor held seats, which reflects the makeup of the parliament. The important point, though, is that these locations have been chosen according to our analysis of hospital presentations in local hospitals, as I said, bulk billing data, and that desire to ensure an even geographical spread.
Independent MP for Kooyong and Dr Monique Ryan is sceptical of the government's plans for urgent care and wants modelling on their cost effectiveness released. Monique joined us earlier. Monique Ryan, welcome to the program. Over the weekend, you called on the government to release modelling demonstrating the cost effectiveness of urgent care clinics. You've said you're worried about pork barrelling. What are your concerns here?
Thanks, Olivia. Well, look, in the last 2 weeks, we've seen the federal government commit $8 billion, I should say, to Medicare funding, and the opposition very quickly agreed to fund it, although we have no idea exactly what their plans are around healthcare funding. In the last 18 months, we've seen the Albanese government put over $1 billion into 87 urgent care clinics. And as of yesterday, they've said they've got another $644 million for another 50 clinics. But my question is, are the urgent care clinics doing what they're supposed to do? What they're supposed to do is take pressure off emergency departments and give Australians an opportunity to receive best quality health care out of hours without having to wait 2 or 3 hours or longer to be seen in an ED. My question is, are they working? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? Are we getting cost-effective care, or are we actually doing something which could have potentially unintended negative consequences and have a significantly negative impact on GP services in this country? GPs don't like the urgent care clinics. They've got concerns about them. I'd really like some evidence from the government before we put another huge swathe of money into this program that it's working.
Okay. There does seem to be a bit of a split in opinion among the medical community when it comes to the effectiveness of urgent care clinics sort of generally. Would your views be different if they were doctor-led instead of many of the urgent care clinics being nurse-led, for example?
Oh, it's not about whoever's providing the service. It's just about the service that's being provided. And I think everyone thinks, great, an urgent care clinic, this is fantastic. I can go and get free service. I don't have to go to an ED. Out of hours, there'll be someone there and they'll be able to help me out. The concern is that the government's putting a huge amount of money into these clinics, which are existing clinics. They're just giving extra money to these big corporate-led GP clinics, when often there's a GP clinic 100 metres down the road, which could potentially provide the same level of service at a much lower cost. That's what we're looking for, best quality care for all Australians at all times of the day, while providing the assurance, I guess, that we're not that care is not detrimental to other parts of the healthcare system.
We've seen both the major parties investing billions of dollars or committing to invest billions of dollars in health over the past week or so. How would you prefer the government invest this money in the health system? Do you see kind of any gaps that aren't being filled?
Well, we've had lots of reviews of general practice and general practice provision in this country in recent years. And it was good to see the government put more money into Medicare recently, the $8 billion that they committed. But they haven't actually followed the advice of those independent reviews, which is that we need to move away from fee-for-service, where doctors get paid for seeing people when they're sick, and we need to move to different models of care where doctors get paid to keep people well. There are ways that we can do that, but we're not addressing those fundamental issues with the Medicare system, which is an issue when we've got an ageing population with an increasing incidence of chronic disorders. So neither the government nor the opposition is really giving us assurance that they are moving the Medicare system in the way that we need it to move going forward, with an ageing population where we do need to provide a different pattern of provision of care over time.
I wanted to drill down on that bulk billing announcement a bit more. When the Prime Minister made that announcement in the seat of Bass, he was holding a Medicare card, and it struck me that he said people will no longer need a credit card to go to the doctor under the plan. Is that a bit of a risky promise to make, given there are many GPs, especially in inner city suburbs, metropolitan areas, who won't take up the bulk billing incentive because it's not viable for them to do so?
I was out in the streets of Kooyong yesterday and a GP approached me and said, that announcement put the fear of God into her. She's actually said her blood run cold, because she said, I can't run my practice on the bulk billing incentives such as they are. And so if that's the direction in which we go, my GP practice will have to close. So I do think that there is an issue with these all-encompassing announcements by politicians about these sorts of things. They do tend to come back and bite you. What we really need to do with healthcare, as with defence spending and every other big part of the government's program, is to look at the best evidence for how to achieve the aims that we're trying to achieve. If we look at healthcare, we want universal, affordable healthcare, but we don't have that at this point in time. People are massively out of pocket when they see a specialist. We're about to see private health insurance premiums are going up by 3.7% on average on the 1st of April. There are lots of cracks in our healthcare system that neither of the major parties are looking to address with any foresight or forward planning or clarity about their plans and how they're going to address these in an evidence-based way.
Is it fair to say then that the government's setting up a false expectation then on this bulk billing announcement?
I would have thought that Mr Albanese might have learnt with his pronouncements before the last election about the cost of electricity that these things can be easier to promise than they can be to deliver. And rather than brandishing a Medicare card and making big promises, I would hope that both Mr Albanese and the Prime Minister and Minister Butler would be providing us with a more evidence-based approach to how they're going to improve healthcare in this country in the years to come.
On a slightly different topic, national security, it's now very much on the agenda for the upcoming Australian federal election, given the febrile global environment. Obviously, there are a lot of structural pressures, on the budget, whether that be health, aged care. Do you think we need to invest more in the defence space, given recent events?
There is evidence that our defence spending is probably a little bit under at the moment, and that we should review that, and I think that's an important thing to do. But as I've said with healthcare, I think that any increase in spending that the country undertakes should be evidence-based. I was really concerned that the Leader of the Opposition came out yesterday and said that he would like to commit a further $3 billion to purchase of F-35 aircraft, given that the Defence Strategic Review last year concluded that that was not the right direction for our government to go. So I would hope that any increase in our defence spending, which might well be warranted given the current instability globally, would be evidence-based and would take into account a really reasoned and rational evaluation of our future needs and what can be deliverable in the short and long term.
You've mentioned before that in your seat of Kooyong, the cost of living, house prices and climate change are all key issues. I'm curious, what feedback have you been receiving, perhaps over the weekend, regarding Donald Trump, Ukraine and the Chinese naval vessels that conducted those live fire exercises off Australia's coast?
It was really interesting, actually. I was door knocking over the weekend. My team door knocked 2,000 homes in Kooyong over the weekend. And people are concerned about safety, but they're not concerned about international safety. They're actually concerned about safety locally, about community safety and the incidence of youth crime in Kooyong, which is really, really high. So rather than Mr Dutton putting $3 billion into F-35s, my community would like the federal and state governments to work together on community safety and policing. That is the issue which is most front of mind within the electorate of Kooyong in recent days.
Can I quickly ask you, in 20 seconds or less, will you outline who you'll support in the event of a hung parliament before voters head to the polls?
I'll be really happy to support either major party if, in the incidence of a hung parliament, they will bring to the people of Kooyong appropriately evidence-based policies on how they're going to deal with the economic challenges of our time, the housing crisis and the climate crisis. And I'll support them if and when they do that.
There's speculation that either side of politics will be able to form a majority. Just lastly, would you be willing to be a speaker in the event of a hung parliament?
I'm an independent, I'm a proud independent, and I have every intention of remaining a proud independent and not taking on any other significant roles in any future parliament.
Monique Ryan, thank you so much for your time today.
It was a pleasure.
And here are some of our top stories this half hour. Coastal communities in southern Queensland and northern New South Wales are preparing for tropical cyclone Alfred. The system is southeast of Brisbane and forecast to turn westward toward land tomorrow, potentially impacting the coast from Thursday night. Authorities are concerned its trajectory is putting communities not prone to cyclones in the firing line. European countries are willing to play a role to secure Ukraine under a potential peace agreement to end Russia's war. European leaders have been scrambling to fill a perceived security vacuum after the extraordinary rupture in relations between the US and Ukraine. Both the Prime Minister and opposition leader have reaffirmed Australia's support for Ukraine. The opposition is accusing Labor of pork barrelling over its 50 proposed urgent care clinics. Labor has committed to spending $650 million to open more Medicare clinics if it wins a second term. The government rejects suggestions of pork barrelling, but the opposition leader says it needs to explain how it chose the locations for the clinics. Let's bring in our political panel for today. Greens finance spokesperson Barbara Pocock and LNP Senator for Queensland Matt Canavan. Welcome to you both. We'll get to some other news in just a second, but Matt, can we go to you first on Cyclone Alfred? How is Queensland's community preparing and how concerned are you?
Yeah, look, I'm a bit further north than the potential impact here in central Queensland, but I've spoken to people in Brisbane today. There's a level of wariness because this is not something typically southeast Queensland has to deal with. I think the last defined cyclone that hit the area was 50 odd years ago now, so not too many would have been alive then. But there's a resilience in Queensland. Southeast Queensland's definitely used to natural disasters like floods, and the main thing in the next few days is for people to listen to authorities and stay safe. These days, with warning systems and modern buildings, typically cyclones can be lived through without major or any loss of life, often even the most devastating ones. But look, there'll then be a massive clean-up if it does hit, so I'm sure the rest of the country will help southeast Queensland get through this.
Just to broader issues now, there's an expression in our game that all politics is local, and undoubtedly issues such as the cost of living are going to be at the heart of the upcoming election campaign. But we have been seeing a number of global events spill over into the domestic sphere and perhaps taking on more importance than the leaders of the major parties had anticipated they'd be facing at this point in the election cycle. Anthony Albanese opened up a cabinet meeting today criticising the former government's handling of a Chinese warship visit back in 2019. If I could just go to you again, Matt, first. Does the Prime Minister have a point on this, drawing an equivalence between the actions of China on both occasions?
Look, I just wish the Prime Minister would stop politicising the relationship. He's done this from the get-go. He sought to blame the coalition for the deterioration in the relationship over the last few years and made the suggestion that it was him and his magic wand that fixed everything just within a few months. Clearly, the exercises we saw last week show that the issues in our relationship with China persist beyond just the particular type of government we have here in Australia. There are some fundamental differences, of course, between our two countries. There are some tensions in the South China Sea and China's territorial demands there, including against some of our friends and allies like the Philippines and Japan. And last week's exercise probably a reflection of that. So it would be better if we just dealt with this as Australians. We should stand up for what we believe in and the laws that we think should be upheld in our region. We obviously have a very, very strong business relationship with China, but that should not stop us from standing up for what is right in our region. And I'm sure the coalition are willing to do that at any time with the Australian government, because, as I say, we should all approach these matters as Australians.
Barbara, the coalition was very critical of how the Albanese government has handled these China vessels essentially sailing around Australia, conducting some of those live fire exercises. What's your take on this?
Well, I think the conversation you can get more readily in Adelaide right now, and I think around our country, is what's going on in the Oval Office and what's happening with our major ally in the US. I think that has really dominated most conversations I've had. I think you're absolutely right that we are seeing a major geopolitical shift, a pivot in the way the US is working with its allies, and I think Australians are horrified by what we have seen in that Oval Office. The attitude towards an ally, someone who's waged a war for 3 years against a tyrant, against a leader in Putin who murders his opposition as not a democratically elected leader. And I think those are issues which we really need to pay attention to. How is our allyship with the US changing? What level of independence do we need there? And it's only 3 weeks since we sent a very large cheque, $800 million to the President of the US, a down payment on a massive spend on nuclear-powered submarines, $368 billion coming up. So I think a lot of Australians are actually completely preoccupied with cost of living, but when they think about foreign policy issues, front of mind right now, I think will be that horrific performance in the Oval Office.
Barbara, you say there that you're horrified by the actions of Donald Trump in the Oval Office. We have heard both sides of politics essentially backing in Ukraine, but Peter Dutton did go a little bit further today, saying that if he were to be elected, that he'd actually directly lobby Donald Trump to support Ukraine more generally. Do you think that Anthony Albanese needs to strengthen his language somewhat?
I think that is a non-issue. I think that is a beat-up. I think we've got a president in the US who doesn't understand what AUKUS means. Both those major leaders are backing in AUKUS. We are in a very challenging position, and I think many smaller countries, we are a significant country internationally, but our relationship with the US has changed with the nature of the presidency that we see there, the way that the president is acting towards allies. We see a major shift in the way the European allies are responding. And I think that's the critical issue. Where do we go in that relationship? And a little bit of jockeying and chest thumping between those two major party leaders is not the main game. We have to be thinking about what's our position as Australians in relation to the changing geopolitical circumstances we find ourselves in. And I just will say that I spent yesterday outdoor knocking in the most marginal seat of South Australia, the seat of Sturt, and no one in that seat, no one I spoke to raised issues of foreign policy, of massive spends, $3 billion we've just heard on fighter pilots. It's about cost of living, it's about how we're managing our households. It's about you can't get a place to rent in Sturt at the moment and the challenges that are there at that much more local level. That's where people's thinking is right now, and that's where we need our politicians to be focusing.
Senator Canavan, I will just quickly bring you in on Barbara's comments there about concerns regarding AUKUS. Do you think that the nuclear submarine pact deal has a question mark hanging over it now, considering some of the commentary we've seen from Donald Trump in recent weeks, I should say?
Well, there's no real evidence of that. I mean, it's not unusual for a president not to know all the acronyms of different things, and to some respects it's nice not being at the centre of attention down here in the South Pacific. You don't really want to be in that frame. I mean, the nuclear submarine deal is well supported by all sides of politics in the US. It is a good deal for Australia. We've got to do something to defend our own country. Now, it shouldn't be used as a distraction from the other needs we have in our armed forces, and that's why the coalition has announced that we should also continue to bolster our air forces as well. This government had cancelled or deferred the purchase of another 28 joint strike fighters a couple of years ago. The question is, why do that? Given the geopolitical situation we face, it's not the right time to be deferring defence spending. A legitimate criticism of AUKUS is, look, we don't get the nuclear submarines for some time. That is true. That's why we shouldn't scrimp on our defence spending today. Of course, though, we should still plan for long term, given it does take a long time to acquire these type of major naval assets.
Over the weekend, Labor unveiled a policy that will cost the budget $95 million and only save beer drinkers less than 1 cent a pint. Barbara, what was your view on this announcement? Was it fiscally responsible, or could that money have been spent better elsewhere?
Well, I just don't know where it came from. I can't understand, given all of the issues facing our country, facing householders, trying to get to a GP, trying to pay the rent, looking at the price of groceries increasing so significantly, why that piece of policy popped onto Labor's radar. I don't see the case for it. I don't see why we're doing it. We know we've got some really significant challenges in our country around alcohol, and why we would do something like that when the Labor Party, for example, on a much more pressing policy question, but gambling reform and the use of ads that our kids are seeing, why it chose to do that kind of policy when there are so many more significant issues.
Sorry to cut you off there, Barbara. Yeah. But Matt, could I just quickly get your response to that? Why did the Coalition back this Labor policy idea in?
Well, because inflation's been very high and the excise is linked to inflation. Keep in mind this is a tax, obviously, so the government's not subsidising alcohol, it's just reducing some of the tax it would otherwise take. And in the last few years, that tax has gone up a lot because under the Anthony Albanese government, inflation has been world-leading highs. We've had inflation rates of 8% and more. So that is all. Those increases are fed through to increases in the tax, and that's not really, I think, what the CPI indexation was meant to be about. It's meant to be keeping the real value of the tax, so a little bit of return makes sense here and helps Australian households at the same time.
Thanks to both of you for your time this afternoon. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but thank you for your insights.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, Matt.
UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has doubled down on the nation's support for Ukraine following the extraordinary clash between US President Donald Trump and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office over the weekend. The Prime Minister says Russia cannot be allowed to dictate terms of a peace deal with Ukraine and rejects suggestions that the US is no longer a reliable ally following its policy shift on the conflict.
I do not accept that the US is an unreliable ally. The US has been a reliable ally to the UK for many, many decades and continues to be. There are no two countries as closely aligned as our two countries, and our defence, our security and intelligence is intertwined in a way no two other countries are. So it's an important and reliable ally for us.
For more on the fallout of that Oval Office exchange, former Australian Ambassador to the United States, Arthur Sinodinos, joined us earlier. Arthur Sinodinos, welcome to the program. What were your first thoughts when you saw what unfolded in the White House over the weekend as Donald Trump, JD Vance and Volodymyr Zelensky clashed?
It was very confronting. It was tough stuff. And normally, you know, when people engage in that sort of exchange, it's behind closed doors. That sort of diplomacy is best left behind closed doors. I think you had in Zelensky someone who's under a lot of pressure. I think in the American side, you had a president and a vice president who are frustrated, who clearly want Zelensky to essentially sign the minerals deal and roll over without necessarily getting all the guarantees that he believes he needs to secure a durable ceasefire and peace for his country. So, you know, you had a really tough situation, and I'm hoping that it doesn't ultimately set back the course of getting something sensible done that gives Ukraine the security guarantees that it needs going forward.
Yeah, they were extraordinary scenes. Do you think Volodymyr Zelensky has any room to express his displeasure at how he was treated, or does he essentially just have to cop it, given the situation he finds himself in?
Well, I don't think he should be doubling down. I mean, he probably should have taken a leaf out of Macron and Starmer's book about how you handle the president, how you try and win him over. I don't know that that would have led to greater concessions, but he would have avoided these scenes that we saw last week. And for him to apologise, I mean, you know, he's got to think about his constituency. The American president may have been thinking about the American people, but Zelensky would be thinking, apologising to the president for what? For standing up for his country and asking for durable security guarantees. That's what this is about. It's existential for him. His country is at stake and his life is at stake probably as well.
Yes. I mean, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, he's expressed a strong, unequivocal support, I believe was his quote, for Ukraine. There has, though, been very little criticism of Donald Trump or JD Vance. I understand the government is in a tricky position here. Peter Dutton this morning, though, has said the coalition's position on Ukraine is different to the United States. Do you think the Prime Minister needs to be that firm in his language?
I think people got what the Prime Minister was saying. Dutton was obviously very clear in his language. The good thing is that the Australian system is standing up on this issue and calling out what's happened, which is aggression by one country against another, a bigger country against a smaller country in breach of international law. And we, as a medium-sized country, we rely on a rules-based order. And for it to be trashed is potentially a huge issue for us going forward.
Well, on the rules-based order, it does feel like we're at a tipping point. How do we advocate for our values while also keeping an important strategic and economic partner in the United States on side?
Well, I believe we can do both. We can have a productive relationship with the United States if we accept that the United States is in even more of a transactional mode than it has been in the past, and that what we have to do is continually find ways to remind the US of why its interest is bound up, its security interest is bound up in being allied and partnering with countries like Australia. At the same time, we need to keep reaching out to like-minded democracies who, like us, support a rules-based system. The EU, Canada, Japan, Korea, you go through the list. We all need to keep standing together. But in the case of the US, if it's going to be America first, we've got to make sure that it's not America only.
On tariffs, Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, has continued his criticism of Australia's aluminium imports. He's accused Australia of essentially dumping product into the US market. It sounds, though, like we're not going to be getting an exemption. They're due to come into play in, I believe, 9 days.
I think at the moment the chances are more than 50% that we won't get an exemption, just by the way Navarro has kept up the pressure. Now, it's possible at the last minute there could be a reprieve, but the thing to remember is that even if we get a workaround on the steel and aluminium tariffs, there are all sorts of ways we're going to be impacted by a world in which tariffs are going up rather than down, costs are going up, inflation possibly going up, trade investment is lower, and tariffs in particular on China will have an important flow-on effect to Australia as it's our main trading partner.
We've seen the coalition arguing that we'd be in a better position to negotiate, a carve-out if Anthony Albanese had made a personal visit to Washington. That's obviously a political line, but knowing how Donald Trump negotiates and makes deals, is there some merit to this argument?
Well, I argued in a piece a few months ago that once there was a new president in the US, that the Australian Prime Minister should go sooner rather than later to establish a personal relationship. Now, it's complicated at the moment. We're about to go into an election, so making another trip overseas might have been seen as having a downside. But there's no doubt that resolving these sorts of issues in the end comes down to leadership by the President and the Prime Minister. They're the two main deal makers in a situation like this. But look, the situation is what it is. We're about to have an election, and that in itself may well shape what comes next.
If an election isn't held until May 17, the Prime Minister still has a very short window of time in which he could go to Washington, DC to meet with Donald Trump. Do you think that would be a good idea?
Well, I think we could have an election announced next week, so we're then going to be into a campaign, and I don't think a Prime Minister would leave the country during an election campaign unless it was a real emergency. So we'll have to wait and see, Olivia.
Okay. It is barely 5 weeks into Donald Trump's second term, and already the US president has promised to turn a devastated Gaza Strip into the Riviera of the Middle East. He's urged Canadians to become America's first state and also offered to buy Greenland from Denmark. He's then, of course, been this public spat with Volodymyr Zelensky over the weekend. When it comes to Australia, is it time to formulate a plan B when it comes to our security alliances?
Well, I think the reality is that we have to work on the relationship with a new person in the White House. We've got a new customer in the White House. We've got to work out how best to push their buttons. in the interests of our security, because it is important for us to keep reminding Americans that their security and our security are intimately bound up. We're an independent country and we exercise our sovereignty, but part of our sovereignty has been exercised to enter into arrangements like ANZUS and AUKUS in our national interest. And I think it's important for us to keep going. In tandem with that, though, we should continue to build productive relationships with like-minded countries in our part of the world and other parts of the world, so we can together uphold the rules-based order. One particular place that we need to work together with other countries on is the World Trade Organization, which at the moment is effectively moribund. We need to revive the organisation because international trade rules are of great benefit, particularly to small and medium-sized countries like Australia.
It's a good point. As a former ambassador to the United States, do you still see Washington as a reliable partner to Canberra?
I think there is a challenge, given that America no longer sees themselves as necessarily the world's policeman or as underwriting the global rules-based order. That's why, for us, it has to be about how we convince the Americans that it's mutually beneficial to be involved in the sort of defence and security arrangements that we've been involved with them before. If you want reliability, you've got to be able to show the other partner that you'll be reliable as well. But as I said, we've got to keep our other options open by continuing to develop strong, productive relations with other countries in our region and beyond.
We touched on the upcoming federal election briefly. Ultimately, we know because of just the complexities on the world stage that national security will be one of the political battlegrounds or pressure points. Do you have a view on who would be a better leader to deal with the new Trump administration, Peter Dutton or Anthony Albanese?
Well, look, I'm a former Liberal politician. I know Peter Dutton well. I think he would be a strong leader. But whichever leader comes out of this election will have a mandate from the Australian people to represent them on the world stage. And the important thing will be for both sides of politics here, I think, to agree that we must continue to try and keep the alliance with the US in good repair, that we should keep increasing our own defence expenditure, as you were just discussing with Katie Gallagher, and that we seek, wherever possible, to show the world that we can be a strong and reliable partner and one which supports like-minded democracies.
That's a good point. I will just pick you up on your response just there. There have been calls from Europe, indeed the United States, on countries to increase their defence spending as a percentage of GDP. Do you have a figure in mind of what Australia should be aiming for? Obviously, we've got a different strategic environment to, say, our allies in Europe and indeed the US, but is there kind of a ballpark figure that you think would ensure national security?
That's a hard question to answer without looking at the capabilities that you need to sort of guarantee the sort of national security you're talking about. But going up to, say, 3% of GDP, I think would be good, possibly further. Very difficult to do in the current environment in Australia where the budget is constrained. But this is also an environment where I think the election will have to be about real issues, not just of what we do about our national security, but about how we manage our economy to maximise our growth and prosperity. And that provides a basis, a strong economy for a strong defence.
It's certainly going to be a multifaceted campaign. Arthur Sinodinos, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
China's ambassador to Australia says the government has stretched the definition of a national security risk with a ban on artificial intelligence app DeepSeek on government phones. China's top diplomat wrote an opinion piece in the Australian newspaper today claiming Australia has politicised trade and undermined technological progress. To talk about the facts over DeepSeek, let's bring in Tim Miller, a professor of artificial intelligence, at the University of Queensland. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Olivia.
Tim, what did you make of the Chinese ambassador's criticisms of the government's decision to ban DeepSeek on official devices?
I think it's to be expected. I mean, I think the primary concern that the Australian government has is the Chinese government's ability to access data that's on the DeepSeek servers. And so I think it's probably to be expected that an ambassador would probably claim that that's overreach.
The ambassador says, as you say there, that the government is basically overreacting. Can you explain to our viewers what kind of risks apps like DeepSeek pose?
Yeah, so any of these types of models, it's not just DeepSeek. You should be thinking about it like ChatGPT and Google Gemini as well. They store information about you. They store your IP address. They store your email. In most cases, they store the things that you have in the chat, and they keep that data held. And I think you should be careful doing that with any of these types of acts. But I think the specific concern that the Australian government have is the worry that the Chinese government will try and get hold of that data, which they don't seem to have with other Western governments.
So while there's this ban when it comes to DeepSeek for public servants on government devices, it is still available to be downloaded for the general public. Would you personally download DeepSeek on your phone or your computer?
I mean, I've accessed it through a web browser. I don't access it because I don't really have a need to, because I use other models. I think it's probably fine for personal use, and if you're not going to put any personal information in there. But if there's any personal information you're worried about putting in there, I would apply the same type of stringent guidelines to any other large language model, any other generative product that you use, or anything, even things like search engines.
So this is something that I guess viewers need to be mindful of when using other platforms for, say, ChatGPT, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about do you trust the people who hold your data there? And so that's meaning, are you trusting large tech companies, OpenAI, Google, companies like this? If you trust them, then you should probably trust them to hold their own data. You can certainly have conditions around licenses that you buy, and if you think that they're going to adhere to them, then you should use it. In this case here, the risk is that maybe the Chinese government will get access to it, but you might trust the US government not to get access to others.
So there are clear concerns in the artificial intelligence space. We've also seen this idea that AI is running out of data to train itself on. What's happening here? Is artificial intelligence progress already slowing down?
Yeah, we can see the progress. It's slowed down a lot since its initial burst, and it's largely around running out of data. It's also about just the cost of building these. It costs more and more computational power to build each model better and better. And sort of to get a small increase, you have to have an exponential increase in the amount of computational power you do, which is all dollars. So ChatGPT costs about $100 million. But we can definitely see it's more or less consumed all the data that's available right now, and it's only new data that comes out. The big risk is that the new data that comes out is itself coming out of large language models. A lot of the stuff on the internet is coming out, and that could also pose some risk down the line. Okay.
On cyber more generally, the Australian National Audit Office, they released a pretty scathing review last week saying the Australian Taxation Office's use and governance of AI is only partly effective. It essentially highlighted some potential policy gaps and ethical concerns. AI often feels a bit like the Wild West. How can potential risks be mitigated?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. It's like the $64 million question. And I think it's probably not that hard to mitigate some of those risks. It's really it's always a trade-off between the stuff you have to do to mitigate those risks and the cost that it takes and the limitations that it has. And so there was definitely concern around the Australian Tax Office as whether it's kind of over-surveilling and overusing these types of things here. I can't comment on that. I don't know really well how they use them. But I think it's always these trade-offs, and it's really a matter about making it clear to, in this case, the Australian public, what are they using it for, how are they using it, what data are they accessing, how are they building models. If you make all that kind of stuff clear, I think you can go some way to mitigating some of these perceived risks anyway.
An election, it's just around the corner. Do you think politicians need to do more to ensure AI models are fair and free from bias, protecting privacy and having appropriate accountability arrangements in place?
Yeah, so I mean, it's important to remember that these AI products are they're already regulated by privacy law, HR, everything like that. They're already regulated. It's really, the problem is that a lot of those regulations came before the AI boom, so they're probably not quite suitable. So I think what needs to happen is some of those regulations need to be updated in order to be, you know, sort of better in this sort of contemporary environment. But I think it's partly up to the government, and it's also partly up to organisations. If you talk to people in organisations, they don't really want to do bad stuff. It's just largely they're not sure how to navigate this space properly, and it's a matter of helping them get educated on how to do it.
We did see some comments from the Chief Information Officer of the world's largest cybersecurity company, Palo Alto Networks, and they essentially warned that big tech companies, they're in this kind of arms race to build bigger and better AI or platforms. Is the prioritisation of this speed over safety a problem, really, when it comes to artificial intelligence? I'm hearing that it's leading to an explosion in malware, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? I mean, it's at the moment the competition is to see who can build the biggest model that wins on some benchmark data sets, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of care going into, well, actually, what are these models useful for and what can we use them for? If you look at, for example, Google have put it on the top of their search engine summaries. Is that really useful? Most people don't seem to find that particularly useful. So there's a really big race to build these things and put them in products everywhere, and a lot of people don't seem to find them that useful or helpful. There's definitely use cases for it, and I think that's taken away, or throwing all that money at building larger and larger models is taken away from a lot of things we could have done differently.
Thanks very much for that. We really appreciate your insight as always. That's afternoon briefing for today. We appreciate you being here on the show with us. Stay with us here on ABC.